The blood moon hung low over Loudoun County, Virginia, casting everything in shades of rust and shadow. 12-year-old Samuel pressed his small body against the rough bark of the storage shed, his breath coming in shallow, silent gasps as he watched Overseer Thaddeus Crane drag Joseph Monroe through the dirt toward the forbidden orchard. Joseph's heels carved twin trails in the earth. His hands clawed uselessly at Crane's massive forearms. The overseer's face remained expressionless, cold as creek stones, as he hauled the 30-year-old worker toward the grove of ancient apple trees that stood at the northernmost edge of the Harrington plantation. The trees that everyone whispered about. The trees where screams went to die. Samuel knew he should run back to the quarters. Knew that being caught out after curfew meant the whip, maybe worse. But something held him frozen in that shadow, something beyond fear. A terrible need to witness. To remember. The forbidden orchard rose before them like the fingers of buried giants clawing up through the soil. 9 trees, each more twisted and gnarled than the last, their branches reaching toward the blood-stained moon in configurations that seemed to defy nature. The oldest sat in the center, a massive, ancient thing with bark like scarred flesh and limbs that bent at angles that made Samuel's stomach turn. The Harringtons had owned this land for 30 years, but these trees had stood here far longer, drinking deep from Virginia soil that remembered things best forgotten. "Please," Joseph's voice cracked across the September night. "Please, Mr. Crane, I swear I didn't steal nothing. I swear on my mama's grave." The backhand came swift and brutal. Joseph's head snapped sideways, blood spraying black in the moonlight. He crumpled, but Crane yanked him upright by his shirt collar, dragging him deeper into the orchard's embrace. Samuel's fingernails dug into the shed's weathered wood. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He wanted to close his eyes, wanted to run, wanted to be anywhere but here. But his body refused to obey. Some part of him, the part that had watched his own father whipped until the white bone showed through, the part that had seen his sister sold away south when she was just 8 years old, that part needed to see. Needed to know exactly what they were capable of, these men who called themselves masters. The wind shifted, carrying the sickly sweet smell of rotting apples. The September harvest had been brutal, 18-hour days beneath the merciless sun, baskets that never filled fast enough, quotas that climbed higher with each passing week. 3 workers had already collapsed. One, old Thomas Ashford, hadn't gotten back up. They'd buried him in the red clay earth beyond the orchard's edge, no marker, no word spoken over the grave. Just another body returned to dirt. Crane reached the center tree and shoved Joseph against its trunk. The overseer pulled a coil of rope from his belt, thick hemp, rough enough to tear skin, and began fashioning it with practiced efficiency. Not a noose. Something worse. A harness designed to suspend a man by his wrists, to leave him hanging from a low branch with his toes just barely scraping the ground. Designed to make every muscle scream, to dislocate shoulders, to teach lessons that would be remembered in aching joints for years to come. "You know what happens to thieves on the Harrington plantation," Crane said, his voice flat and emotionless as winter ice. "Mr. Cornelius Harrington runs a Christian household. We don't abide stealing." "I didn't," Joseph started, but Crane's fist drove into his stomach, doubling him over. Samuel bit down on his own hand to keep from crying out. His eyes burned with tears he couldn't shed, wouldn't shed. Not here. Not now. As Crane hoisted Joseph up, looping the rope over a branch worn smooth by previous use, the trees seemed to lean inward. Their branches creaked and whispered, a sound like old women gossiping in church pews, like secrets being shared in the dark. The leaves rustled though the night air had gone still. And for just a moment, one terrible, crystalline moment, Samuel could have sworn he heard voices in that rustling. Dozens of voices. Hundreds. The voices of everyone who'd suffered in this place, beneath these branches, crying out in a language that predated words. Joseph's feet left the ground. His body convulsed as his full weight settled onto his shoulder joints. The sound he made was barely human, a high, keening wail that seemed to come from someplace deeper than his throat. From his very soul. Crane stepped back, surveying his work with the detached interest of a craftsman examining a particularly difficult piece of carpentry. He pulled a pocket watch from his vest, silver, probably worth more than every person on this plantation combined, and checked the time. 4 hours ought to do it, he muttered. 4 hours to think about what you done. 4 hours to contemplate the wages of sin. He turned and walked back toward the main house, his boots crunching on fallen apples, leaving Joseph swaying gently in the blood moon's glow. Leaving him to the mercy of the night and the twisted trees and whatever else lived in the forbidden orchard after dark. Samuel remained frozen for another 5 minutes, watching Joseph's silhouette twist slowly in the darkness. Watching the way the tree's branches seemed to bend closer, almost protectively. Watching the shadows that shouldn't have been moving, that couldn't have been moving, slide across the ground like living things. And then he saw it. Written in the tree's bark, carved deep into that ancient wood, were markings. Not random scars from weather and age, but deliberate cuts. Names. Dozens of names, maybe hundreds, carved small and hidden in the twisted grain. Samuel couldn't read most of them, reading was forbidden, dangerous, a whipping offense, but he recognized a few letters his mama had secretly taught him before she'd been sold away. These trees remembered. They kept a record written in their own flesh of everyone who'd suffered here, everyone who'd been broken beneath their branches. The forbidden orchard wasn't just a place of punishment. It was a ledger. A testament. A witness. Samuel finally found the strength to move. He slipped back through the shadows toward the quarters, his bare feet silent on the cooling earth. But something had changed inside him in that moment. Something had cracked open and let the light, or maybe the darkness, pour in. The trees whispered behind him. And though he was only 12 years old, though he was small and powerless and trapped in a world designed to grind him into dust, Samuel understood with sudden, terrible clarity that the trees were waiting. That they'd been waiting for a long time. That one day, perhaps soon, they would bear a different kind of fruit entirely. Behind him, Joseph's sobs echoed through the orchard. Above him, the blood moon smiled its crimson smile. And all around, the ancient apple trees creaked and swayed and remembered everything. Everything. If you're drawn to these dark chapters of history, subscribe now and comment below which untold story we should uncover next. The Harrington family had ruled their 600-acre domain 3 miles northeast of Waterford, Virginia, for 30 years with fists of iron and hearts of stone. Their empire stretched between the shadow of the Catoctin Mountains to the west and the muddy banks of the Potomac River to the east, a kingdom of apple trees and human misery, where the fruit grew sweet and the suffering grew sweeter still. Cornelius Harrington stood as patriarch of this dynasty of cruelty. At 58 years old, he was a massive man gone thick around the middle, with silver-streaked hair he wore long in the old Virginia fashion and eyes the color of dirty ice. He'd inherited the plantation from his father, who'd inherited it from his father before him, each generation adding more acres, more trees, and more souls to the ledger of the damned. Cornelius prided himself on running what he called a proper Christian establishment. Morning prayers were mandatory, Sundays meant Bible readings in the yard, and blasphemy earned a man 10 lashes at the whipping post. But no amount of scripture could wash the blood from his hands. His wife, Constance Harrington, was a woman carved from New England granite and Virginia ice. 45 years old, rail-thin, with a face like a hatchet and a disposition to match. She oversaw the house servants with meticulous cruelty, measuring their work in impossible standards. A spot on a dish meant a day without food. A wrinkle in a tablecloth meant an hour kneeling on dried corn kernels in the kitchen. She smiled rarely, and when she did, it never reached her eyes, those pale blue orbs that looked at human beings the way other women looked at furniture that needed dusting. But it was the Harrington sons who truly embodied the evil that had taken root in this place. Preston Harrington, the eldest at 32, had inherited his father's build and his mother's cold efficiency. He managed the orchard operations with the precision of a battlefield general and the mercy of a hangman. He'd studied agriculture at the University of Virginia and returned with modern ideas about maximizing productivity from Negro labor. He kept detailed records in leather-bound journals: which workers picked the most apples, which ones slowed during the afternoon heat, which ones showed signs of laziness that required correction. His corrections were legendary in their brutality. Preston believed that pain, properly applied, was the finest motivator ever devised. Wallace Harrington, 28, was different but no less monstrous. Where Preston was calculating, Wallace was impulsive. Where Preston punished with cold deliberation, Wallace exploded with sudden violence that left men bleeding in the dirt for infractions as minor as making eye contact or failing to step aside fast enough on the path. He was handsome in the way poisonous plants are beautiful, golden-haired, blue-eyed, with a smile that could charm birds from trees. That smile had fooled many people over the years. It had never fooled the workers who saw what lived behind it. Together, the Harringtons had perfected a system of terror that kept their plantation running like a well-oiled machine of human suffering. The day began at 4 in the morning when Overseer Thaddeus Crane rang the iron bell that hung outside the quarters. Workers stumbled into the pre-dawn darkness, their bodies already aching from yesterday's labor, knowing that today would bring more of the same. Breakfast was cornmeal mush and, if they were lucky, a piece of salt pork the size of a child's fist. Then out to the orchards as the sun rose red over the Catoctin Mountains, painting the apple trees in shades of blood. During harvest season, August through October, the work became a kind of waking nightmare. Each worker received a quota, 10 bushels a day or face consequences. The baskets were heavy, the ladders unstable, the branches unforgiving. Children as young as 6 worked the lower limbs while adults climbed high into the canopy where the best fruit grew. The sun beat down mercilessly, turning the orchard into an oven that baked the sweat right out of human bodies. Water breaks were granted twice a day, 10 minutes each, and anyone caught drinking from the creek at other times earned themselves a meeting with Preston's favorite whip, a braided leather monstrosity he'd named Salvation. The punishment tree rituals had started years ago, long before Samuel was born, but they'd become refined into a twisted art form under Preston's management. A worker who missed quota would be taken to one of the apple trees in the forbidden orchard and tied with their arms around the trunk, forced to embrace the rough bark while Preston delivered his lessons. 20 lashes for a first offense. 40 for a second. Third offenses earned a trip to the hanging branches, where they'd be suspended for hours while the family ate their dinner and discussed crop yields. But it was the casual cruelties that truly broke spirits. 70-year-old Jeremiah Williams, who'd worked the Harrington orchards for 40 years, was forced to keep picking even after his hands had gnarled into useless claws from arthritis. When he could no longer climb the ladders, Wallace made him crawl on hands and knees gathering fallen apples from the ground, laughing as the old man whimpered with each movement. Young mothers worked through the final months of pregnancy, their swollen bellies pressed against ladder rungs, because Constance Harrington believed Negro women birthed easier than white ladies and had no need for coddling. 3 women had lost babies in the orchards over the past decade. Their names were carved into the trees, tiny memorials hidden in the bark. Children watched their parents beaten and learned to swallow their tears. To cry was to show weakness, and weakness invited more punishment. 8-year-old Rebecca Thornton had once screamed when she watched Preston whip her father. Preston had made her stand and watch for the full 50 lashes, his hand clamped over her mouth, forcing her to witness every moment while he whispered in her ear about what would happen if she made another sound. The rotting fruit and rotting souls became one and the same. Apples that fell before harvest were left to decay where they landed, filling the orchard with the sweet sick smell of fermentation. It mixed with the copper scent of blood, the salt of sweat, the sharp tang of fear. The smell soaked into clothing, into skin, into the very earth until you couldn't tell where the rot ended and life began. But everything changed on September 15, 1860. Martha Caldwell was 19 years old, barely more than a girl, with her mother's warm smile and her father's quiet dignity. She'd been feeling poorly for days but knew better than to complain. Complaints earned you a reputation as lazy, and lazy workers found themselves standing before Preston's record books while he decided their fate. So Martha climbed her ladder, filled her baskets, ignored the way her vision blurred at the edges and her hands trembled on the rungs. She fell just after noon. Her body hit 3 branches on the way down before landing in a broken heap at the base of one of the oldest trees. Her neck had snapped somewhere in the fall, a mercy, some would say later, though mercy seemed a strange word for anything that happened in the Harrington orchards. Preston was eating lunch on the main house veranda when the commotion reached his ears. He walked out to the orchard with his napkin still tucked into his collar, surveyed Martha's twisted form, and checked his pocket watch. "Well, that's a shame," he said, his voice carrying across the frozen silence. "She was a decent picker. You there, Thomas, Joseph, Benjamin, get a shovel." What happened next would be spoken about in whispers for years to come, the moment when something fundamental cracked in the souls of everyone who witnessed it. Cornelius Harrington arrived as they were digging. He looked down at Martha's body, then at the hole being carved into the earth at the tree's base, and his face split into a grin that belonged on a skull. "Bury her there," he said, pointing to the roots of the apple tree. "Right there beneath the branches. These trees need feeding same as anything else, and I'll be damned if we waste good fertilizer. Come spring, this tree will give us the finest apples on the whole plantation. Nothing feeds fruit like the dead." He laughed then. A booming, genuine laugh that echoed through the orchard and seemed to make the very leaves recoil. They buried Martha Caldwell while the Harrington family watched. Buried her without words, without ceremony, without even a marker to show where her young body had been returned to the soil. Just another piece of fertilizer for the trees that would bear fruit for the master's table. That night, as the blood moon rose over Loudoun County, as Samuel watched Joseph hanging from the forbidden orchard's branches, something stirred in the hearts of every worker on the Harrington plantation. Something dark and patient and absolutely inevitable. The trees drank deep from Martha's grave. And though no one could prove it, though it sounded like madness to even think it, every worker felt in their bones that the trees were waiting for something. Waiting for justice to finally take root in soil that had been watered with tears for far too long. Subscribe if you want more forgotten tales of resistance, and drop a comment telling us what you think drove them to this point. The conspiracy began not with words, but with looks. 3 days after Martha Caldwell's body was planted beneath the apple tree like seed corn, the workers moved through the orchards with their eyes speaking a language older than Virginia itself. A glance held too long between Joseph Monroe and Benjamin Tucker as they passed with full baskets. A deliberate nod from Florence Davies, the cook, as she carried water to the fields. The slight tightening around old David Washington's mouth when Preston Harrington rode past on his chestnut mare, inspecting the day's progress with those cold accountant's eyes. David Washington was 40 years old and had survived 20 years under Harrington rule, a feat that spoke to either extraordinary luck or extraordinary will. Most likely both. He was a tall man, lean as a fence post, with shoulders broadened from 2 decades of orchard work and eyes that seemed to look straight through whatever they fixed upon. His hands bore the scars of 1,000 small rebellions, the time he'd grabbed a hot branding iron meant for a child, the morning he'd stepped between Wallace's fist and young Samuel's face, the countless hours spent working past the point where other men collapsed. But David's greatest strength wasn't his body. It was his mind, sharp and patient and capable of seeing 3 moves ahead like a chess master. He'd watched the Harringtons for 20 years, studying them the way a hunter studies dangerous game. He knew Preston took his evening walk at precisely 7 o'clock, following the same path through the east orchard. He knew Wallace drank too much whiskey and slept heavy as a stone come midnight. He knew Cornelius counted every apple, every basket, every worker with obsessive precision, but never thought to count the lengths of rope in the barn or notice when small amounts went missing. Most importantly, David knew the forbidden orchard better than any living soul except perhaps the trees themselves. The first real meeting happened on September 21st, 8 days after Martha's murder. The quarter moon hung thin as a knife slash in the autumn sky, providing just enough light to walk by but not enough to be easily seen. David waited until the midnight bell had long since rung, until even the house servants had stopped moving behind the main house windows, until the world had gone still and silent except for the cricket songs and the whisper of wind through apple leaves. He moved like smoke through the darkness, his bare feet silent on the packed earth paths between the quarters and the orchards. Others joined him, shadows detaching from shadows. Joseph Monroe, his shoulders still aching from his time on the hanging branch. Benjamin Tucker, 35 years old and strong as an ox, who'd watched his wife sold away south 5 years prior. Thomas Ashford's son, Robert, 22 years old and burning with rage that had nowhere to go but inward. Young Samuel, who shouldn't have been there but refused to stay behind when David tried to send him away. They gathered in the forbidden orchard, beneath the 9 ancient trees that had witnessed everything. Beneath the very branches where so much suffering had occurred. There was a poetry to it that wasn't lost on any of them, meeting in the heart of their torment to plan their liberation. Florence Davies was already there, waiting with the patience of someone who'd been planning this moment in her head for years. At 53, she was the oldest woman on the plantation, had been cooking in the Harrington house for 30 years. She heard everything, every conversation over dinner, every argument between Preston and Wallace about managing the workers, every casual cruelty discussed like one might discuss the weather. Her kitchen was an intelligence hub, and she'd been gathering information with the dedication of a wartime spy. "They're planning to sell 12 of us south come December," she said without preamble, her voice barely above a whisper. "Cornelius says the orchard's producing too much, that he's got more workers than he needs now that the harvest's nearly done. Preston's already got the buyers lined up. Families from Georgia and Mississippi looking to stock up before winter." The words fell like stones into still water, rippling outward into silence. 12 people. 12 more lives torn apart, 12 more journeys into the deeper horrors of the Deep South, where plantations made the Harrington orchards look merciful by comparison. "My daughter's on that list," Robert Ashford said, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. "Sarah. She's only 14. They're selling her to a cotton plantation in Natchez." David let the moment breathe, let the rage and grief fill the space between them. Then he spoke, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of 20 years of calculated patience. "Then we don't wait for December." The words hung in the air like smoke. Like possibility. Like the dangerous, intoxicating promise of freedom that could only be bought with blood. "The autumn harvest ends in 3 days, David continued. September 24th. Cornelius always throws his celebration dinner on the final day, gets drunk with the buyers from Leesburg and Middleburg, counts his profits, congratulates himself on another successful season. The overseers get drunk too. Wallace and Preston both. The whole house smells like whiskey and roasted pig. They celebrate while we bury our dead and wonder who gets sold come winter." "What are you saying?" Benjamin asked, though the gleam in his eyes suggested he already knew. David looked up at the branches above them, thick and strong and scarred by use. The trees seemed to lean closer, listening. In the moonlight, the names carved into their bark stood out like silver veins. "I'm saying we make them answer for what they've done. Every lash. Every child sold. Every body buried in unmarked graves. Every moment of suffering they've inflicted for 30 years. I'm saying we use these trees one last time, but not the way they've been used before." "You're talking about killing them," Joseph said flatly. "Killing white men. Masters. You know what happens if we fail. You know what happens even if we succeed." "I know what happens if we do nothing," David replied. "We die slow, one piece at a time, until there's nothing left but ghosts walking around in skin. I've been dying slow for 20 years, Joseph. I'm tired of it. I'm ready to die fast if that's what's required, but I'm going to die free." Florence reached into her apron and pulled out a small notebook, Preston's record book, stolen from his study during dinner service. She'd risked a whipping, maybe worse, to take it. The pages were filled with neat columns documenting every worker, every quota, every punishment administered over the past 5 years. "They keep records of what they've done to us," she said, her voice steady as stone. "They write it down like it's something to be proud of. Like we're cattle to be counted and culled. Maybe it's time we wrote a different kind of record. The kind that gets remembered." Over the next hour, they planned with the careful precision of generals preparing for battle. Florence would provide information about movements in the main house. Benjamin would gather rope, not all at once, but a length here, a coil there, taken from the barn and the equipment sheds over the next 3 days so no one would notice. Robert would recruit others he trusted absolutely, his sister Ruth, his uncle Jerome, the field workers who'd been here longest and suffered most. Joseph would map the exact locations of each overseer's quarters, each family member's bedroom, every possible avenue of escape or resistance. And David would plan the actual sequence. Which tree for which master? Which branches would bear which weight? The order of operations that would turn the forbidden orchard from a place of torture into a place of final reckoning. "We need to be clear about what this is," David said as the meeting drew toward its end. "This isn't escape. This isn't running for the North Star and hoping we make it. This is justice. The kind of justice that won't be forgotten. The kind that gets talked about in whispers for 100 years. We do this, and some of us will die. Maybe all of us. But we'll die having shown them that we're not cattle. That we're not furniture. That we're human beings who can strike back." Samuel, who'd been silent throughout, finally spoke up. His voice was young but steady, unshaken by fear. "The trees want this," he said. "I know how that sounds, but I've heard them. At night, when I'm lying awake, I hear them creaking and whispering. They've been keeping track, writing down names in their bark. They've been waiting for someone to act. They'll help us if we let them." The adults exchanged glances. None of them dismissed the boy's words as fantasy. They'd all felt it, that strange sentience in the forbidden orchard, the way the branches seemed to bend toward suffering like flowers toward sun, drinking it in, remembering everything. 3 days, David said, standing. 3 days to prepare. 3 days to say goodbye to the people we love who aren't part of this. 3 days to make peace with whatever comes after. Then on September 24th, when the blood moon rises over these orchards again, we take back what's been taken from us. We make these trees serve us for once. We turn this place into something they'll never forget. They dispersed into the darkness one by one, shadows returning to shadow. But something had shifted in the forbidden orchard that night. The air tasted different, sharp and electric, like the moment before a summer storm breaks. The trees creaked though there was no wind. And deep in their ancient rings, in the heartwood that had stood witness to decades of horror, something stirred. The orchard was preparing for a different kind of harvest. Above them, the thin moon smiled its knowing smile. 3 days until it would swell full and blood-red again. 3 days until justice, terrible, inevitable, absolutely deserved, would finally bloom from branches that had borne only suffering for far too long. The forbidden orchard whispered its approval. And somewhere in the main house, Preston Harrington woke from a nightmare he couldn't quite remember, his heart racing, his sheets soaked with sweat that smelled inexplicably of apples and rope and earth freshly turned for graves. September 24, 1860. The day dawned clear and cold over Loudoun County, Virginia, with frost crystallizing on the apple leaves and morning mist rolling down from the Catoctin Mountains like the breath of ghosts. The final day of harvest. The day Cornelius Harrington would count his profits and toast another successful season. The day everything would change forever. The workers moved through their morning routines with mechanical precision, their faces carefully blank, their eyes trained downward in the submissive postures the Harringtons expected. But beneath the surface, electricity crackled through every glance, every slight nod, every seemingly accidental brush of shoulders as they passed in the orchard rows. 23 people knew what was coming. 23 souls who'd decided that tonight, under the blood moon that would rise full and terrible over the apple trees, the ledger would finally balance. David Washington picked apples with steady hands, filling basket after basket, meeting his quota with the efficiency of 2 decades' practice. But his mind was elsewhere, reviewing the plan one final time, checking for flaws, for weaknesses, for the 1,000 things that could go wrong when the oppressed finally rise against their oppressors. The rope was ready, 6 lengths hidden in the tool shed behind the broken plow, each measured to exact specifications. Florence had confirmed that Cornelius had invited buyers from 3 neighboring counties for the celebration dinner. More witnesses to the Harrington wealth, more bodies that would complicate the night's work. But complications could be managed. Everything could be managed if they moved with precision and purpose. As the sun climbed higher, Preston Harrington rode through the orchards on his chestnut mare, his leather record book tucked under his arm, counting baskets and making notations with his expensive fountain pen. He stopped beside David's ladder. "You've been working here longer than most," Preston said, not looking up from his figures. 20 years, according to my father's records. "You've seen a lot of changes in that time." "Yes, sir," David replied, his voice carefully neutral. "Good workers know their place," Preston continued, finally glancing up with those cold calculation eyes. "Bad workers get ideas above their station. Get notions about things that don't concern them. You've always struck me as a good worker, David. I trust that won't change." There was something in Preston's tone, a note of suspicion, perhaps, or merely the casual cruelty that came as naturally to him as breathing. David met his eyes for just a moment, saw the question lurking there, and understood that Preston sensed something. Some shift in the air, some disturbance in the natural order he worked so hard to maintain. "No, sir," David said. "That won't change." Preston held his gaze for 3 heartbeats longer, then spurred his horse forward. But David noticed the way Preston's hand rested on the pistol at his belt, the way his eyes scanned the orchards with new wariness. They would need to move carefully tonight. Very carefully. The afternoon stretched long and golden. The final baskets were filled, the final quotas met. As the sun began its descent toward the Catoctin Mountains, painting the sky in shades of amber and blood, the workers were dismissed to the quarters. The Harrington family began preparing for their celebration. The smell of roasting pork and fresh-baked bread drifted from the main house kitchen, mixing with the sweeter scent of apple pie and the sharp bite of whiskey being poured into crystal decanters. At 7 o'clock, as the first stars emerged and the eastern horizon began to glow with the promise of moonrise, carriages arrived bearing the plantation owners from Middleburg and Purcellville. Wealthy men in expensive suits, their wives in silk dresses that cost more than a human life, all come to congratulate Cornelius Harrington on another profitable season. Their laughter echoed across the grounds, obscene in its carelessness. At 9 o'clock, Florence Davies served the main course, roasted pork with apple glaze, mashed potatoes swimming in butter, fresh bread still warm from the oven. She moved through the dining room like a shadow, refilling wine glasses, clearing plates, all while listening to the men discuss cotton futures and the political situation with those damned abolitionists up north. Constance Harrington presided over the table with her usual icy efficiency, making sure everything met her exacting standards. "To another year of prosperity," Cornelius said, raising his glass. His face was already flushed with drink, his voice booming. "To the finest orchards in Virginia, and to the proper order of things. May the Lord bless our endeavors and keep every man in his rightful place." "Here, here," the guests chorused, their glasses catching the candlelight like captured stars. Florence caught David's eye through the window. She gave the slightest nod. The masters were drunk. The time was coming. At 10:30, the blood moon began to rise, massive and red as a wound, climbing above the tree line with terrible slowness. It cast everything in shades of rust and shadow, turned the apple orchards into something from a fever dream. The forbidden orchard seemed to glow in that crimson light, the 9 ancient trees standing like sentinels waiting for a judgment that was 30 years overdue. At 11 o'clock precisely, David gave the signal. A single match struck outside the quarters, its brief flare visible to everyone who'd been watching for it. 23 people moved into the darkness with practiced silence. They'd gone over this so many times in whispered conversations, in the coded language of the oppressed, that no words were needed now. Everyone knew their role. Everyone understood what was required. The first target was Overseer Thaddeus Crane. He lived in a small cottage at the edge of the plantation, close enough to the quarters to respond quickly to any trouble, but far enough from the main house to give him privacy for his darker pleasures. 6 men approached his door: David, Benjamin Tucker, Joseph Monroe, Robert Ashford, and 2 brothers named Daniel and Joseph Freeman who'd lost their mother to fever after Preston refused to let her rest during harvest. The door wasn't locked. Crane was arrogant enough to believe himself safe here, surrounded by people he'd spent years terrorizing into submission. That arrogance would be his final mistake. They entered like smoke, spreading through the small cottage with practiced efficiency. Crane was in his bedroom, already half undressed for sleep, a bottle of whiskey on the nightstand beside his Bible, the hypocrisy of it almost beautiful in its completeness. He looked up as 6 shadows filled his doorway, his eyes widening, his hand reaching for the pistol he kept under his pillow. Benjamin's massive hand clamped over Crane's mouth before he could cry out. Joseph grabbed his wrist, twisting it away from the weapon. The overseer thrashed, his body bucking against their grip, but he was one man against 6 who'd been dreaming of this moment for years, decades, lifetimes. They hauled him upright, Benjamin's hand still sealed over his face, muffling the sounds trying to escape his throat. They dragged him out into the blood moon night. Crane's eyes rolled white with terror as he realized where they were taking him, toward the forbidden orchard, toward those 9 ancient trees that had witnessed his cruelty so many times before. His feet carved frantic trails in the frost-touched grass. His body convulsed in their grip. But there was no escape. There had never been any escape, not really. This moment had been inevitable from the first time he'd raised his hand against another human being and called it righteousness. They brought him to the oldest tree, the massive, gnarled patriarch that stood at the heart of the forbidden orchard. The same tree where Crane had suspended Joseph by his wrists. The same tree that had watched Crane deliver punishment after punishment, had drunk in the suffering like water, had kept its silent record in rings of growth that would outlast empires. David pulled the first length of rope from where it had been hidden in the hollow of an adjacent tree. Hemp rope, thick and strong, with a noose already tied, not the kind designed to break necks quickly, but the kind that would lift a man slowly, let him feel every second of what was coming. "Please," Crane managed to gasp as Benjamin's hand shifted slightly. "Please, I have money. I can get you papers. Freedom papers. I can." "We don't want your papers," David said quietly, looping the rope over a branch worn smooth by years of use. "We don't want your money. We want you to answer for what you've done. Every lash. Every scream. Every moment of suffering you inflicted because you could. Because you enjoyed it. Because you thought you had the right." They fitted the noose around Crane's neck. His body went rigid, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps that fogged in the cold air. The blood moon hung directly overhead now, huge and terrible, turning everything beneath it the color of old rust. "You asked God to bless your work," David continued, his voice steady as stone. "You quoted scripture while you tortured us. You called yourself a Christian while you turned human beings into livestock. So let's see if your God answers now." 6 men pulled on the rope. Slowly, steadily, with the kind of patience that comes from having endured the unendurable. Thaddeus Crane rose into the air, his feet kicking, his hands clawing at the hemp around his throat. The branch creaked but held. It had held so much weight before, so much suffering, and now it would hold this one last burden. His face turned purple, then blue-black in the moonlight. His movements became spasmodic, desperate, the final thrashing of something that had once been a man and was now just meat and terror and justice finally being served. The tree seemed to lean inward, its branches bending close as if to witness, to remember, to record this moment in its ancient wood alongside all the other names, all the other stories it had collected over decades of standing witness. At 11:47, by the pocket watch Benjamin had taken from Crane's vest, Overseer Thaddeus Crane stopped moving. His body swayed gently in the blood moon's glow, turning slowly, a grim pendulum marking the passage from one era into another. The men stood in silence for a long moment, watching. Waiting for guilt or remorse or horror to wash over them. But there was only a strange, cold satisfaction, the feeling of a debt finally paid, a balance finally struck after years of compounding interest calculated in blood and tears. David said softly. 8 more to go. Hit subscribe to ensure you never miss these chilling historical accounts, and comment your thoughts on this act of desperate justice. The celebration dinner in the main house continued, oblivious. Through the tall windows, the conspirators could see candlelight flickering, could hear the muffled sound of laughter and the clink of crystal glasses. Cornelius Harrington was telling some story that had the assembled plantation owners roaring with amusement, his hands gesturing expansively, whiskey sloshing from his glass. They had no idea that the world had already shifted beneath their feet. That the first domino had fallen. That justice was moving through their orchards like flood water through a broken levee. Wallace Harrington left the party at 12:15, stumbling slightly as he made his way toward the barn. Florence had watched him drink glass after glass of bourbon throughout dinner, had seen his eyes grow glassy and unfocused, his movements loose and uncoordinated. He was going to check on his favorite stallion, a nightly ritual when he was drunk, some sentimental attachment to the animal that he'd never shown to any human being. He never made it to the stable. Samuel and Robert Ashford had been waiting in the shadows beside the path, pressed against the side of the carriage house where the moonlight couldn't reach. As Wallace passed, swaying on his feet and humming some tuneless melody, they stepped out behind him. Samuel carried a length of wood, a fallen branch, ironically enough, from one of the apple trees. He swung it with all the strength in his 12-year-old body, connecting with the back of Wallace's skull with a sound like an axe biting into wet wood. Wallace dropped without a sound, crumpling face first into the dirt. For a moment, Samuel stood frozen, the branch still raised, staring at what he'd done. At what had become necessary. Then Robert's hand on his shoulder brought him back. "Good," Robert whispered. "Now help me carry him." They dragged Wallace's unconscious body toward the forbidden orchard, his expensive boots leaving twin trails through the frost. He was heavier than he looked, dead weight that seemed to resist every step. But rage made them strong. Rage and the memory of every casual cruelty this man had inflicted, every sudden explosion of violence, every smile that had preceded pain. The others were waiting at the second tree, the one Wallace himself had favored for whippings, a massive oak apple hybrid with branches that grew at perfect right angles to the trunk. Joseph and Benjamin hauled Wallace upright as consciousness began to seep back into his body. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused, trying to make sense of the scene before him. "Wah," he started, then stopped as he saw Thaddeus Crane's body swaying from the adjacent tree. "What is this? What have you?" Benjamin's fist caught him in the stomach, doubling him over. They worked quickly, efficiently, the rope already prepared, the noose already tied. Wallace began to struggle in earnest now, the fog of alcohol and concussion burning away in the face of absolute terror. He kicked and thrashed, his mouth opening to scream, but Robert shoved a rag between his teeth, muffling the sound to nothing more than desperate whimpers. "You remember Rebecca Thornton?" Robert asked quietly, holding Wallace's face steady so their eyes met. 8 years old. You made her watch while you whipped her father 50 times. You held your hand over her mouth just like this, whispered in her ear about what would happen if she cried. You remember that, Wallace?" Wallace's eyes showed he remembered. Showed he knew exactly what was coming and why. "This is for Rebecca," Robert said. "And for every child you terrorized. Every person you hurt because you could. Because it made you feel powerful. Let's see how powerful you feel now." They lifted him, the rope going taut, the branch creaking its familiar song. Wallace's scream died behind the gag as his feet left the ground. His body convulsed, fighting with every ounce of strength he possessed, but there was no mercy here. No rescue coming. Just the ancient tree accepting its burden, just the blood moon casting its crimson light, just justice finally being served. At 12:37, Wallace Harrington hung beside his overseer, two bodies swaying in the September night like grim fruit finally ripened and ready for harvest. Inside the main house, Preston Harrington checked his pocket watch and frowned. Wallace should have returned by now. His brother might be impulsive and violent, but he was never gone long. Preston excused himself from the table, Constance's sharp eyes following him as he stepped out onto the veranda. The night was quiet. Too quiet. The normal sounds of the quarters had gone silent, no voices, no movement, nothing but the whisper of wind through apple leaves and the distant call of a night bird. Preston's hand moved instinctively to the pistol at his belt. Something was wrong. He could feel it in his bones, in the way the air tasted strange and electric, in the way the blood moon seemed to pulse overhead like a beating heart. He never saw them coming. They emerged from the orchards like shadows made flesh, 10, 12, 15 people moving with coordinated silence. Preston's hand closed around his pistol grip, but Benjamin Tucker's massive form crashed into him before the weapon cleared leather. They went down in a tangle of limbs, Preston's head cracking against the veranda boards hard enough to see stars. "Help," he tried to scream. "Father. Someone." A hand clamped over his mouth. Joseph's face loomed above him, backlit by moonlight, transformed into something beyond human. Something biblical and terrible and absolutely without mercy. "Your father's next," Joseph said softly. "But first, we're going to take you to your tree. You know which one I mean, don't you, Preston? Your special tree. The one where you kept your records. Where you documented every punishment like you were proud of it. Like it was something to be celebrated." They hauled him upright and dragged him toward the forbidden orchard. Preston fought every step, his expensive suit tearing, his face scraping against the ground, his mind racing through impossible calculations trying to find some escape that didn't exist. Through the windows of the main house, he could see the dinner party continuing, could see his father holding court, could see salvation just yards away and completely, utterly unreachable. The forbidden orchard opened before them like a mouth. 2 bodies already hung from the trees, Preston recognized them even in the distorted moonlight. Crane. Wallace. His brother was dead. His brother was hanging from an apple tree like common livestock and the full horror of what was happening crashed over him. This wasn't chaos. This wasn't random violence. This was planned. Organized. Deliberate. They'd been plotting this, preparing for it, and he'd seen nothing, suspected nothing until it was far too late. They brought him to the 3rd tree, his tree, as Joseph had said. The one where he'd kept his leather-bound journals documenting worker efficiency, where he'd administered corrections with mathematical precision, where he'd perfected the science of suffering. The branches were thick and strong, scarred by years of use, and they seemed to reach toward him now like arms eager to embrace. "Please," Preston gasped as they fitted the noose around his neck. His Harvard education, his modern agricultural techniques, his careful record-keeping, none of it mattered now. None of it could save him. "Please, I can change things. I can free you. All of you. Legal papers. Money. Anything you want. We want you dead," David Washington said simply. "We want you to answer for every name in those journals. Every quota that couldn't be met. Every lash administered. Every life you calculated and discarded like arithmetic. You kept records, Preston. You documented everything. Consider this the final entry." The rope pulled taut. Preston Harrington rose into the air, his feet kicking frantically, his hands clawing at his throat. His mind, that sharp calculating instrument that had served him so well in managing human chattel, could only process the unbearable irony, that he would die here, at his own special tree, recorded by the same kind of meticulous documentation he'd always valued. At 1:15 in the morning, Preston Harrington stopped struggling. His body joined his brother's and the overseer's, 3 forms swaying in the blood moon's light like a message written in flesh and rope for anyone who could read it. Inside the main house, Cornelius Harrington finally noticed his sons were missing. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor, cutting through the conversation. "Preston. Wallace." His voice carried an edge of concern that was rapidly crystallizing into fear. "Constance, have you seen the boys?" Constance Harrington's face went pale. She'd been feeling it too, that wrongness in the air, that shift in the natural order she'd spent her life enforcing. She moved to the window and looked out toward the orchards, toward the blood moon hanging obscene and huge above the apple trees. And she screamed. Because in the distance, silhouetted against that crimson orb, she could see them. 3 bodies hanging from the forbidden orchard's branches. 3 forms that looked impossibly, terribly familiar even at this distance. The remaining dinner guests rushed to the windows. Chaos erupted, women shrieking, men shouting, someone knocking over a crystal decanter that shattered across the floor like crystallized tears. Cornelius Harrington stood frozen, his face transforming through a dozen emotions in as many seconds: confusion, disbelief, dawning horror, and finally, rage. Pure, incandescent rage. "Get the rifles," he roared. "Every man arm yourself. They've killed my sons. They've." The main door crashed open. 23 people flooded into the house, moving with the coordinated precision of soldiers taking a fortress. Florence led them, her face set in lines of grim determination, a kitchen knife gleaming in her hand. The dinner guests pressed back against the walls, their weapons still in the gun room, their courage dissolving in the face of the oppressed finally rising. Cornelius Harrington reached for his belt pistol, but Joseph Monroe was faster. He crossed the room in 3 strides and slammed the plantation owner against the wall hard enough to crack plaster. The pistol clattered to the floor. David kicked it away, then bent to retrieve it, weighing the weapon in his hand. How many times had he stared down the barrel of this particular pistol? How many times had Cornelius used it to enforce obedience, to terrorize, to remind everyone of their place in his carefully ordered world? "Your sons are hanging in your orchard," David said quietly, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. "You're overseer too. And you're about to join them. Not because we're animals. Not because we're savages. But because you spent 30 years teaching us that might makes right. That the strong rule the weak. That suffering is just the natural order of things. We learned your lessons well, Cornelius. We learned them very, very well." Cornelius's face went purple with rage and terror. "You'll hang for this. All of you. The law will. The law." Joseph laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "You are the law here. You've been the law for 30 years. Judge, jury, and executioner all wrapped up in one God-fearing Christian package. But tonight, Cornelius, tonight there's a higher law in session. And it's got a lot of verdicts to deliver." They dragged him toward the door. The remaining guests cowered, making no move to intervene. They understood, in that moment, that they were witnessing something beyond their control. Something that had been building for decades, for centuries, finally reaching its terrible culmination. The forbidden orchard waited, its branches creaking in anticipation, the blood moon casting everything in shades of judgment and reckoning and justice that had been far, far too long delayed. They brought Cornelius Harrington to the center tree, the ancient patriarch of the forbidden orchard, the massive gnarled giant that had stood witness to 3 decades of systematic cruelty. The tree where Martha Caldwell had been buried in its roots like fertilizer. The tree that seemed to pulse with something beyond life, beyond wood and bark and leaf. Something that had been drinking in suffering for so long it had transformed into a living testament, a monument to every scream that had echoed through these branches. Cornelius fought them every step, his expensive shoes digging furrows in the frost-touched earth, his voice hoarse from screaming threats and promises and finally, desperately, prayers. But God wasn't answering tonight. Or perhaps God was answering, just not in the way Cornelius Harrington had expected. Perhaps this was the answer: justice delayed but never denied, patience worn to its breaking point, the oppressed finally becoming the oppressor's judge and executioner. Behind them, in the main house, Constance Harrington and the remaining overseers were being dealt with. Jacob Finch, Edmund Cross, Adam Pruitt, and Nathaniel Burke, for men who'd enforced the Harrington system with fists and whips and casual violence. For men who'd never questioned whether what they were doing was right, only whether they were doing it efficiently enough. Ruth Ashford led that group, her face a mask of cold determination as she remembered every indignity, every violation, every moment these men had reminded her she was property and not human. But the center of gravity, the heart of this night's terrible reckoning, remained here in the Forbidden Orchard. Here, where David Washington and his chosen few stood in a circle around Cornelius Harrington beneath branches that seemed to reach down like fingers eager to finally claim what they'd been owed for 30 years. "You buried Martha here," David said quietly, gesturing to the roots at their feet. "Right here, at the base of this tree. You said she'd make good fertilizer. You laughed about it. You actually laughed." Cornelius's face had gone ashen, his earlier rage collapsed into something that looked almost like comprehension. As if, in this final moment, he was finally understanding that every action has consequences, every cruelty plants seeds that eventually bear fruit, every empire built on suffering contains the mechanism of its own destruction. "She was 19 years old," Robert Ashford continued, his voice shaking with controlled fury. "Her whole life ahead of her. But you worked her until she dropped, then you planted her in the ground and made jokes. So yes, Cornelius, you're going to hang from this tree. The same tree that's been feeding on her body for the past 9 days. There's a poetry to it, don't you think? The kind of poetry you always preached about in your Sunday sermons. They fitted the noose, the final noose, the one they'd saved for last, the one tied with particular care." Cornelius Harrington, patriarch of 30 years of systematic evil, looked up at the branch that would bear his weight. At the blood moon that seemed to pulse overhead like a cosmic eye witnessing this moment. At the faces surrounding him, faces he'd seen every day for years, faces he'd never really looked at, never seen as fully human. "I gave you food," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Shelter. Work. Purpose. You gave us hell," Benjamin Tucker said flatly. "You gave us 30 years of hell and called it Christian charity. You want credit for not letting us starve while we made you wealthy? You want gratitude for not beating us to death while we built your empire? No, Cornelius. No credit. No gratitude. Just this." They pulled the rope. Slowly, deliberately, with the same patient inevitability that had characterized their suffering. Cornelius Harrington rose into the air, his feet kicking, his body convulsing, his eyes bulging with terror and understanding in the final, absolute knowledge that this was the end. That there would be no rescue, no reprieve, no last-minute salvation from the God he'd claimed to serve while serving only himself. At 2:47 in the morning, by the pocket watch Benjamin had taken from Thaddeus Crane's vest, Cornelius Harrington stopped moving. His body swayed from the center tree, the patriarch of the Forbidden Orchard finally bearing the weight of the patriarch who turned this place into an engine of human suffering. The work continued through the night. Constance Harrington was brought out at 3:15, her silk dress torn and muddy, her face a rictus of disbelief. She'd spent 30 years enforcing her own brand of casual cruelty, measuring how servants work in impossible standards, punishing with cold efficiency, treating human beings like furniture that needed constant polishing. She hung from the 5th tree at 3:42, her body twisting slowly in the pre-dawn darkness. The 4 overseers followed, one by one, each taken to a tree that held particular meaning. Jacob Finch to the tree where he'd whipped old Thomas Ashford until the man collapsed. Edmund Cross to the tree where he'd separated children from mothers, dragging crying babies away while their mothers screamed. Adam Pruitt to the tree where he'd hanged workers by their wrists for hours, teaching them the meaning of helplessness. Nathaniel Burke to the tree where he'd presided over discipline sessions that left men scarred for life. By 4:30 in the morning, as the first hints of dawn began to paint the eastern sky in shades of gray and pale gold, 9 bodies hung from 9 apple trees scattered throughout the Forbidden Orchard. The conspirators stood in silence, watching the sunrise creep over the Catoctin Mountains, illuminating what they'd done in the pitiless light of a new day. No one spoke. There were no words adequate to the moment. They'd crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, had committed acts that would be called murder by the law and justice by their own hearts. Some of them wept quietly. Others stood stone-faced, their expressions unreadable. Samuel, now forever changed from the boy who'd watched Joseph hanging just weeks before, held on to David's hand like a lifeline. "We need to go," Florence finally said, her voice hoarse from the night's work. "They'll come. Militia from Leesburg, maybe soldiers from Harper's Ferry. They'll come and they'll want blood. We need to scatter. Head north. Find the railroad. Some of us won't make it," David said quietly. "Some of us will be caught. Hanged ourselves, probably, or worse. But what we did here tonight, they can't undo that. They can kill us, but they can't make this not have happened. Can't erase the fact that for one night, in one place, the oppressed rose up and made their masters answer for every crime. That matters. That will be remembered." They dispersed as the sun rose, 23 people scattering into the Virginia countryside, some heading north toward Pennsylvania and freedom, others disappearing into the mountains, a few choosing to stay and face whatever came next with the grim acceptance of people who'd already made their peace with death. The dinner guests from neighboring plantations fled at first light, their carriages racing toward Middleburg and Purcellville, carrying tales of horror and uprising that would spread like wildfire through the Virginia counties. By noon, militia arrived to find the Harrington plantation abandoned except for 9 bodies swaying from apple trees and the workers who'd chosen to remain, elderly people too old to run, children too young to understand, and a handful of souls who simply had nowhere else to go. The Harrington orchard was never worked again. The property passed through 7 owners over the next 50 years, and every single one reported the same phenomena. The trees grew wrong, twisted and gnarled beyond what nature could explain, their branches reaching toward the sky in configurations that suggested grasping hands or screaming faces. The apples, when they grew at all, rotted before ripening, falling to the ground in putrid masses that filled the air with the smell of decay. Workers refused to enter the forbidden orchard, claiming they heard voices at night, saw shadows moving where no shadows should be, felt the overwhelming presence of something watching, waiting, remembering. By 1910, the property was abandoned entirely. The main house fell into disrepair, its windows shattered, its walls collapsing inward like a mouth closing around secrets. The apple trees beyond the forbidden orchard grew wild and unkempt, but those 9 trees, those special 9, remained standing, unchanged, seemingly immune to time and weather and the natural progression of growth and decay. Local Loudoun County residents began calling it Hanging Orchard, in whispered conversations, though official records still listed it as the old Harrington property. Parents warned children away. Ghost hunters and curiosity seekers occasionally ventured in, only to flee with tales of cold spots in September heat, of voices speaking in languages that predated English, of an overwhelming sensation of being judged by something vast and implacable. In 2024, more than 160 years after that blood moon night in September 1860, the 9 trees still stand. They're older now, more gnarled, their bark scarred and twisted into patterns that look disturbingly like faces frozen in various expressions of terror. They bear no fruit. Nothing grows within 20 feet of their trunks, the ground remains bare earth, as if the soil itself remembers what happened and refuses to let anything beautiful take root in ground soaked with that particular mixture of justice and vengeance. Paranormal investigators report consistent phenomena. Electronic equipment fails. Cameras capture orbs and shadows that shouldn't exist. Temperature readings drop 20 degrees in seconds. And always, there's the sound, like rope creaking under weight, like branches bearing terrible fruit, like whispers in a dozen different voices speaking words just below the threshold of understanding. But there's something else too, something that defies easy explanation. Those who spend time in the forbidden orchard, who sit quietly among those 9 ancient trees and listen with more than their ears, report a feeling that transcends horror. A sense of righteous completion. Of justice, however terrible, finally served. Of an account balanced after far too long. Local historians, through painstaking research, have uncovered some of the conspirators' names. David Washington, Florence Davies, Benjamin Tucker, Joseph Monroe, Robert Ashford, Samuel, whose last name was never recorded, Martha Caldwell, whose body still rests in the roots of the center tree, and others, dozens of others whose names were never written down, never preserved in any record except the ones carved in the bark of apple trees that refused to die. The forbidden orchard remembers. The trees remember. And on September nights when the moon rises full and blood-red over Loudoun County, when the air grows cold and still and pregnant with the weight of history, locals swear you can still hear them. The creaking of branches. The whisper of rope on wood. The voices of the oppressed finally making themselves heard in a language that transcends words. The Harrington family name died with them that night. No descendants. No legacy. Just 9 bodies hanging from 9 trees and a story that gets told in whispers, passed down through generations, a reminder that every empire built on suffering contains the seeds of its own destruction. That patience has limits. That justice delayed is not justice denied, merely justice gathering strength for its inevitable arrival. The orchard stands eternal, a monument to resistance. To the moment when the powerless seized power. To the night when those who'd been treated as livestock proved themselves human in the most terrible way imaginable. The trees grow twisted and wrong, but they grow. They endure. They remember. And sometimes, on quiet September evenings when the wind moves through those ancient branches, you can almost hear them whispering the names. All the names. Not just the 9 who hung, but the hundreds who suffered. The names carved into bark, written in growth rings, preserved in the living wood of trees that witnessed everything and forgot nothing. The enslaved orchard workers who hanged every master from the apple trees left behind more than bodies. They left behind a truth that no amount of time can erase, that human dignity, once pushed beyond its breaking point, becomes something far more powerful than those who tried to break it could ever imagine. The orchard remembers. The trees remember. And they will remember forever. Subscribe for more macabre history, and let us know in the comments which dark tale you want explored next.